Thick copper dripped from the shattered crystal chandelier. Warm droplets soaked straight through the cheap, rented silk of my ball gown. The billionaire I fake married tore 3 syndicate assassins into bloody ribbons. Then his spine snapped loudly in half. High society elites scrambled over broken glass. Silk tore. Heels snapped. A towering feral storm took his place. The apex sovereign was supposed to slaughter the entire room. Instead, the lethal shadow dragged its massive weight across the ruined marble, completely ignoring the screaming elites to bow its blood-soaked head directly at my scuffed combat boots. My grease-stained fingers locked tightly around the cold iron handle of a discarded table knife. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Every cartel boss in the blood-soaked ballroom stared in absolute silence, finally realizing exactly who held the chain to the city's deadliest weapon. The shadow released a low, earth-shaking rumble, bearing razor-sharp fangs at any man who dared to even breathe in my direction. Chapter 1. The billionaire she fake married just tore a man's throat out. Bare teeth against flesh. Blood sprayed the reinforced glass. Thick, dark streaks slid downward. Harsh red emergency strobes pulsed. The piercing siren rattled the fillings in her teeth. The heavy steel blast door hissed wide open. Syndicate assassins had breached the bunker. 3 men stepped over the threshold. Black rifles raised. Nova backed away. Her lungs burned with stale oxygen. A massive shadow dropped from the steel rafters. It wasn't Draven anymore. Expensive, bespoke fabric shredded into confetti. A towering shadow took his place. Silver-tipped fur bristled along a spine of pure muscle. Absolute slaughter followed. Liquid violence tore through the room. Talons flashed in the strobe light. Bones snapped like dry kindling. Nova pressed her spine against cold metal. Her grease-stained hands gripped a severed power cable. Fingers shook. She jammed the thick copper into the manual override lever. She forced it down. If more syndicate guards breached the door, silver bullets would rip him apart. The damage was done. Sharp ozone and hot copper coated the air. The final assassin hit the floor. The piercing wail of the emergency siren abruptly cut out. A heavy, suffocating silence crashed over the room, leaving a deafening ring echoing in Nova's ears as her adrenaline flatlined. As the quiet stretched, the towering shadow slowly turned its heavy head. It locked glowing golden eyes directly onto hers. The emergency lights cast long, terrifying shadows across the steel floor. Her pulse skipped. She was convinced she was the next target in this blood-soaked room. A memory of the rust barons flashed behind her eyes. She was surrounded by a pack of starving street dogs, where running guaranteed death. She refused to run then. She refused to run now. She ignored the dull ache in her chest and forced her spine straight. The towering creature took a slow, heavy step toward her. It released a low, rumbling vibration that rattled the floorboards like a tectonic fault line shifting deep beneath the earth. Did the feral storm inside the calculating CEO even recognize the temporary, fake wife he had legally bound to himself just 3 weeks ago? With every frantic heartbeat, the predator crept closer. The small room thickened with lethal danger and a wave of pure primal heat that electrified the fine hairs on her arms. She refused to run or scream or beg for her life. She chose instead to drop the severed copper cable, letting the heavy metal clatter loudly against the cold concrete floor. Between one ragged breath and the next, she held out her small, grease-stained hand toward the massive creature in the dark. Draven! The apex sovereign stopped moving. It leaned its massive weight forward to draw in the scent of bitter motor oil, cheap soap, and the absolute lack of terror in her veins. The terrifying shadow lowered its massive, blood-soaked head. It pressed a wet snout gently into the waiting palm of her rough, trembling hand as the tension finally broke. The moment their eyes locked, a spark of crackling static and pure electricity shot straight up her arm, tethering her soul. The most dangerous creature in the entire city was kneeling for a nobody scrapyard mechanic. Red emergency strobes clicked off. Blinding white overheads snapped on. The creature flinched, silver fur dissolved into thin air. Joints popped and reformed. Draven hit the floor. He was human again. Sweat and blood coated his skin. His chest heaved. He stared up at her in absolute horror. His bloody fingers twitched toward her ankle.
Copper and bitter death coated his tongue. Draven pushed off the cold metal grid. His lungs burned, his mind fractured. Shaking, pale hands hovered in front of his face. Dark, warm blood dripped from his knuckles. Not his blood. He looked up. Nova stood perfectly still. Her dark eyes were wide. She didn't look away. A sickening wave of panic seized his chest. He built the glass obsidian tower to hide the curse. He wore expensive tailored suits to cage it. He forged strict corporate contracts to control it. The savage hurricane had broken free anyway. His greatest, darkest secret stood exposed in front of the lower-class mechanic. He had chosen her for this fake marriage because she was supposed to be disposable. Instead of tearing her apart, his feral wild half had just bowed down to her in complete, unquestioning submission. Why did the violent eclipse inside him willingly submit to a tiny human with engine exhaust permanently stained beneath her fingernails? Draven scrambled, backward across the floor. His bare, blood-slicked chest heaved as the terrifying truth unraveled inside his fractured mind. "Stay back." The rough, ruined demand scraped against the back of his raw throat. Nova took a steady, deliberate step forward, her chin tipped up. "Draven, it's okay. You saved us. They were going to kill us." Her voice trembled with something infinitely deeper than fear. It cracked open the terrifying space between them as he registered the sheer awe in her gaze. She wasn't looking at a monster. She was looking at him like he was a hero, like he was worth something real and true. That misplaced devotion terrified him exponentially more than the syndicate assassins ever could. He locked the predator away 5 years ago after a bloody betrayal. Unleashing the violence only brought death to anyone he dared to care about. He couldn't trust the wolf. He couldn't trust himself. Nova. Her name left his lips like a bitter curse. "Don't look at me like that." He had to push her away because caring for someone was a fatal, bleeding weakness in his ruthless world. He spun around, slamming his hand against the wall security panel. Bloody fingers slipped against the smooth glass keys as he frantically punched in his master code. "What are you doing?" Nova demanded. "Locking you inside." His voice dropped into a freezing, calculated register. The icy, untouchable CEO reclaimed control, desperately rebuilding his steel walls against her. The heavy steel vault door hissed shut. It slammed with a final, echoing boom that severed them entirely. Draven stood alone in the dark hallway. He leaned his forehead against the freezing steel door. His chest heaved as the sharp scent of fried wiring and blood hung heavy in the stifling air. He truly believed that this fake marriage would protect his empire, utterly convinced he held absolute control over every piece on the board. But the primordial king was fully awake now, and it wanted the mechanic. Worse, the syndicate knew his armor was cracked. They would absolutely come back to finish the slaughter. He closed his eyes, unable to erase the burning image of Nova standing utterly fearless in the face of his darkest nightmare. She was supposed to be a disposable pawn. He looked down at his blood-soaked hand. The faint scent of her scorched diesel lingered on his palm. His jaw locked. He would burn the city to ash before he let them touch her.
Hours bled away as she traded the sterile, blood-slicked glass of the obsidian tower for the comforting filth of the junkyard. White-hot sparks showered the concrete. Nova locked her grease-stained grip around the heavy hydraulic plasma cutter. Blinding heat sheared straight through the busted steel ship engine. The sharp, acidic bite of melting iron coated the back of her throat. She shoved her tired weight against the metal. It was a desperate, sweating purge to burn out the memory of Draven's fractured stare. Picking the manual lock on the obsidian tower vault took her 3 minutes flat. A rust baron stray never stays caged. She had sprinted miles through the neon-lit graveyard of the city just to reach this dirty, oil-stained sanctuary. The terrifying image refused to die. A blood-soaked shadow kneeling at the scuffed toes of her worn combat boots. Why did a ruling titan yield its throat to a scrapyard mechanic? The impossible math of it scorched her brain like a branding iron. Survival demanded her focus. The syndicate left no breathing witnesses. Someone handed those assassins the panic room codes. Loose gravel crunched. Expensive leather biting into dirt. The sharp freeze of cedar and winter rain slashed through the heavy stench of industrial grime. Nova whipped around. Draven blocked the junkyard exit. Immaculate charcoal grey silk wrapped him like a fragile cage, hiding the lethal violence sleeping underneath. A thick manila folder rested in his pale grip. You shouldn't have run. The syllables cracked like a freezing whip. Nova shifted her weight. Don't take another step. She didn't cut the power. Her thumb jammed the plasma torch trigger higher. A blinding, roaring jet of white fire erupted between them. Exhaustion and fury boiled her blood. She refused the role of disposable pawn. She refused the suffocating dark of his vault. Draven didn't blink at the roaring flame. I brought a revised non-disclosure agreement. He extended the folder. And a check for $2 million. You need to forget tonight. Ice flooded her veins. Dirty corporate paper to bury the truth. He wanted to shove the beautiful wild cyclone back into the dark. Coward. The Rust Barons taught a brutal lesson. Stolen cash always ends in a bloody leash. She survived the underground cartel by biting the hand that fed her. She wouldn't wear a collar for the syndicate. She wouldn't wear one for Draven. Her arm swung in a violent, practiced arc. The white-hot torch sliced cleanly through the thick manila folder, mid-air. $2 million ignited. Black ash scattered across the oil-stained concrete. Her jaw locked tight. Keep your money. I won't be your secret keeper. She held her ground while he slaughtered trained killers. She offered him her bare hands when he was drenched in copper and death. A cheap liability, a line item on a budget. Dark shadows bruised the skin beneath Draven's eyes. The muscle in his jaw pulsed, wound tight enough to snap bone. Nova forced her spine rigid, locking away the desperate urge to step closer. Her underground crew depended on her daily survival. Weakness in the Barons guaranteed an early grave. He stared down at the smouldering ash. The 3 feet of air between them crackled with suffocating tension and unspoken demands. Nova opened her mouth to order him off her turf. A fast-moving drone blotted out the overhead sodium lights. A high mechanical whir sliced the air. A red laser sight painted a deadly target directly onto the center of Draven's chest.
The burning pieces of the $2 million contract drifted over Draven's Oxfords. He stared at the mechanic, speechless. The plasma cutter's roar faded into a high mechanical whine. A sleek, black syndicate drone hovered 20 feet above the scrapyard. A small silver object dropped from its belly. It cracked violently against the rusted hood of a gutted sedan. Draven closed the distance. His pale fingers wrapped around the cheap silver burner phone. The cracked screen glowed. a live video feed played silently. Frost invaded his veins. Crisp satellite night vision illuminated a subterranean warehouse. Dozens of armed runners loaded unregistered weapons into unmarked shipping crates. A massive, heavily fortified smuggling operation. Standing dead center in the grainy footage, barking harsh orders at the hardened crew, was Nova. The burner phone vibrated against his palm. A single text message overrode the video feed. Surrender the shipping routes, or the mechanic rots in federal lockup. Draven turned his head. Nova's face drained of color. The gritty, untouchable armor completely fractured. The truth slammed into his chest like a freight train. She wasn't a desperate stray hiding in the dirt. She was a tactical mastermind running a black market empire directly beneath his corporate tower. A brilliant, lethal liar. A dark, possessive vibration tore up Draven's throat. The alpha predator didn't care about her crimes. It didn't care about the restrictive laws of high society. It only knew a breathing enemy was actively hunting its chosen mate. The icy CEO clamped down on the rising violence. Cold logic had to win. He built a global empire on ruthless strategy, not feral rage. Unleashing the tempest now risked total exposure. Then the sharp, bitter spike of her sudden terror hit his senses. Nova's throat swallowed hard. Draven, they found my crew. They found my family. Total raw vulnerability stripped her dark eyes bare. She wasn't demanding a blank check. She wasn't begging for his legal team. She was looking at him to be the shield. His own father had traded him to secure a corporate merger 20 years ago. The rich only protected themselves. Draven swore he would never bleed for another man's greed. The syndicate assumed Nova was a soft target. They assumed she was expendable, a fatal miscalculation. Draven closed his fist. Glass and cheap plastic shattered. Shards sliced deep into his palm. He didn't blink. Warm copper dripped onto the gravel. The crunch of plastic echoed, followed by the deafening, rapid thud of their racing heartbeats as the immediate threat settled into their bones. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. Pack your things. The icy corporate whip vanished. A low, gravel-heavy growl took its place. Nova blinked, her breathing erratic. Where are we going? To war. They threatened what was his. The syndicate would burn to ash. No lawyers, no contracts, only iron and blood. The freezing, winter rain finally broke open the sky as Draven grabbed the lapels of his immaculate bespoke suit, locked his golden eyes on hers, and ripped the expensive silk cleanly in half. The torrential midnight rain gave way to a bleak, gray morning, washing the blood from the streets, but leaving the corporate battleground perfectly dry. The violent war Draven craved suffocated beneath cold, corporate ink. Sterile, shadowless fluorescent light beat down on his broad shoulders. He built this glass tower to rule. He built the massive obsidian table to control. He built this fragile cage to trap the inferno inside his own chest. He sat perfectly still at the head of the cold glass. The icy bite of recycled air conditioning tangled with the sharp scent of his cedar cologne. Across from him sat the syndicate leaders. No weapons, only immaculate, tailored silk and poisonous smiles. The oldest board member flicked his wrist. A small silver USB drive slid across the smooth glass. Metal scraped against glass. It halted 1 inch from Draven's pale knuckles. Surrender the scrap trade routes. The old man's voice barely cracked a whisper. Refuse, and this drive goes straight to federal authorities. The thick muscle in Draven's jaw jumped. That tiny piece of brushed aluminum held every shred of encrypted data from Nova's underground warehouse. 1 ounce of metal held the power to vaporize his entire world. We are also stripping your title, Draven. The old man leaned forward. his watery eyes gleaming. "We know you are unstable. We know exactly what kind of feral violence hides beneath your expensive suits." Oxygen stopped in Draven's throat. The betrayal burned like battery acid against his ribs. Someone had sold his security codes to the syndicate. Someone knew his darkest truth. Ice seized his chest. If he unleashed the wolf right now, he could paint the glass walls with their blood in seconds. But the global press would broadcast the slaughter. He would lose his empire. He would lose his freedom. The untouchable crowned beast froze. He was rendered completely powerless by ink and plastic. 20 years ago, a ruthless board of directors legally bled his sick mother's company dry. The memory of her sobbing in the freezing rain locked his joints. He swore he would never wear that weakness. Yet the steel jaws of the trap had already snapped shut. The syndicate leaders smiled. They had neutralized the city's most lethal predator without firing a single bullet. The beast tore at the heavy iron doors of his mind. The violent shadow begged to rip their throats open. It demanded blood to protect its chosen mate. Draven forced the shadow back into the dark. He couldn't shield Nova in this sterile room. His own corporate iron handcuffed his wrists. His pale, trembling hand reached slowly across the cold glass. He would surrender his entire legacy just to keep her out of a concrete cell. Before his fingertips brushed the metal, a small, grease-stained hand blurred past his face. Fingers snatched the silver drive. Draven's lungs locked as his disposable fake wife stepped directly into the lethal line of fire. She slowly turned the silver drive over in her rough palm. A terrifying, lethal smile curved her lips.
Nova watched the billionaire freeze against the expensive leather of his chair. The sterile room faded. Raw, naked terror bled right through Draven's icy armor. The same unstoppable force who had shredded trained assassins into ribbons now sat paralyzed by a half-inch of silver plastic. A lifetime of lies shattered in her skull. She grew up believing the silk tie elites held all the iron in this city. She assumed her oil-stained overalls and street tactics made her worthless. The ugly truth stared her right in the face. These civilized elites were cowards, hiding behind clean white paper. She locked eyes with the smug syndicate board. Liquid fire ignited in her gut. They threatened her hidden empire. They threatened her underground blood. They wanted to burn her life down. She would show them exactly how the Rust Barons fought back. Nova stepped in front of Draven's broad shoulders. Her rough fingers snatched the silver drive off the cold glass. "Put that down." The old syndicate leader slammed his palm against the table. "You filthy mechanic." Nova held the drive directly over the hard marble floor. She opened her fingers. The metal clattered. She raised her heavy, steel-toed combat boot. She drove her heel down with bone-shattering force. Plastic and silver exploded under her tread. The violent crunch echoed sharply off the glass walls. The syndicate leaders jolted backward in their leather chairs. "You stupid little girl." The old man's face flushed a violent, ugly violet. "The data is queued on our master servers. Crushing the physical drive changes absolutely nothing." Nova didn't blink. She refused to beg. She refused the shadows. She refused to wait for a broken monster to save her. "I don't care about your servers." Her voice dropped an octave, steady as forged iron. "When money fails to buy survival, the toll must be paid in copper and blood. A cartel boss blackmailed her father with stolen cargo manifests 10 years ago. Her father surrendered his pride to survive. He died a broken, hollow man in a neon-lit gutter. She would rather choke on her own ash than make that mistake." Nova planted her heavy hands flat on the polished glass table. She leaned her weight forward, invading the old man's air. "You think you hold the power because you sit in a glass tower." A low, dangerous vibration hummed in her chest. You know absolutely nothing about survival." Suffocating silence roared through the room. The sharp ringing in Nova's ears slowly gave way to the heavy, ragged sound of her own breathing as the adrenaline leveled out. Draven stared up at her spine, his golden eyes wide with dark, reverent awe. "You want my shipping routes?" Nova pushed off the glass. "Come to the Rust Barons at midnight. We finish this in the dirt. No corporate ink. No lawyers." She turned her back on the deadliest men in the city. Her pulse hammered a frantic staccato rhythm against her ribs. Pure terror flooded her veins, but she forced her chin high and locked her knees. She didn't look back at Draven as she hit the heavy boardroom doors. She left him sitting frozen in his immaculate, fragile cage. The heavy doors clicked shut behind her, sealing her in the sterile hallway. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers wrapped tight around the cold steel of her illegal switchblade as she prepared to burn the entire city to the ground. The sterile chill of the corporate tower evaporated, replaced hours later by the damp, suffocating dusk of the underground. The heavy night air reeked of cold rain and gasoline. Nova stood dead center in Sector 4 warehouse. Millions of dollars in black market engine parts stacked all the way to the corrugated steel ceiling. 10 years of blood, sweat, and grease, the only leverage keeping her underground crew breathing. Her stained fingers cramped around the thick plastic grip of a marine-grade distress flare. "Boss?" Her youngest runner hovered by the loading bay. "Are you sure?" Nova's chest squeezed tight. When she was 10 years old, a rival street crew burned her uncle's house to the foundation over a single stash of stolen rations. You cannot protect a treasure if the enemy holds the map. Survival meant burning the map yourself. "Go." The words scraped raw against her throat. "Run." The kid vanished into the freezing rain. Metal groaned. The heavy bay doors wrenched upward with a deafening rusted screech. The syndicate walked into her sanctuary, dark, expensive suits, flanking 20 heavily armed cartel enforcers. Safeties clicked off. "We came for the shipping routes, mechanic." The old board member's voice echoed off the concrete. Nova planted her steel-toed boots into the dirt. She locked her jaw. "You can't steal what doesn't exist." She slammed the rough striker cap against the flare's ignition tip. Phosphorus hissed. A blinding, spitting jet of neon-red fire erupted in her grip. "Stop her!" The old man's voice cracked in pure panic. Nova threw the burning flare dead center into a 50-gallon puddle of spilled motor oil. A roaring wall of heat detonated. The shockwave knocked the breath from her lungs. Blinding orange fire clawed directly up the stacked pallets. The suffocating, toxic stench of melting rubber and scorched steel swallowed the warehouse. She stood perfectly still in the blinding heat. 10 years of empire turned into black, choking ash. She broke her own heart. She torched her own leverage. Without the illegal cargo, the syndicate had nothing to hold over Draven. Without the warehouse, they couldn't cage her in a federal cell. The syndicate enforcers staggered backward. They coughed violently as the temperature spiked. "You're out of your mind." A massive enforcer shielded his face from the blistering heat. Nova laughed. It was a raw, ragged, triumphant sound tearing through the smoke. Overhead, a main wooden support beam snapped with the deafening crack of a gunshot. Burning splinters rained down onto her overalls. She didn't flinch. She had just bankrupted her entire existence to protect a billionaire who kept his soul in a vault. A heavy, leather-clad fist lunged through the smoke. It twisted violently into the collar of her jacket. "You owe us $10 million now." The enforcer's breath was hot and sour against her ear. "The underground bosses will take it out of your hide." They dragged her backward. Her steel-toed boots scraped uselessly against the concrete as they hauled her out into the freezing, rain-slicked night. The roar of the inferno muffled into a dull, terrifying hum as the freezing rain shocked her overheated skin. She traded a sterile corporate cage for a bloody underground pit, praying the arrogant alpha wouldn't be stupid enough to follow her into the dark.
Tires screamed against wet asphalt. Draven shoved the heavy door of his luxury sedan open before the car fully stopped. A physical wall of blistering heat slammed into his chest. Sector 4 warehouse was a towering inferno of screaming metal and roaring orange fire. Nova! The roar shredded his throat. The wind shifted. It whipped a thick cloud of toxic black smoke directly into his face. The acrid, bitter sting of melting plastic burned his lungs. Only the violent crackle of collapsing steel answered him. He trusted clean corporate ink. He trusted the sterile logic of the boardroom. Because of that fatal hesitation, his fake wife had walked directly into the fire alone. The icy, untouchable CEO shattered into 1,000,000 useless pieces on the dirty gravel. A low, fault-line fracture started deep within his ribs. The scarred monarch didn't care about the burning millions. It didn't care about the incinerated cargo. The violent tempest only cared that its chosen mate was missing. When Sahai's tip Draven was 15, a rival syndicate locked his closest friend inside a burning vehicle. The suffocating memory of scorched flesh and his own pathetic, human helplessness locked his joints. Never again. Draven stepped closer to the inferno. His expensive Oxfords crunched loudly over the heat-cracked gravel. A flash of polished metal caught the ambient firelight near the muddy tire tracks. He dropped to his knees. His pale fingers closed around the heavy steel of a mechanic's wrench. His thumb brushed across the handle. A fresh, slick smear of dark red blood coated the iron. She didn't burn. She didn't run. She was dragged. They took her. The whispered words vibrated with raw, untethered violence. The fragile, immaculate cage of civility completely dissolved. He didn't fight the agonizing shift. He didn't force the darkened blur back into the dark. Let it out. The command was a guttural gasp. Calcium fractured loudly in the fiery night. The immaculate bespoke silk shredded across his expanding shoulders. Thick, silver-tipped fur violently breached his pale skin. Human fingers twisted and broke, reforming into massive, lethal talons capable of tearing through solid steel. He surrendered the wheel to the monster. He let the feral, blood-starved instincts consume his human mind entirely. The massive, towering creature threw its heavy head back. It unleashed a deafening, earth-shattering roar that physically shook the burning steel of the warehouse. It wasn't a sound of mourning. It was a promise of absolute, inescapable slaughter. The silver behemoth dropped its wet snout to the muddy earth. It bypassed the heavy stench of gasoline and smoke. It locked instantly onto the sharp, distinct scent of her engine exhaust, tangled with the cheap, sour sweat of the cartel enforcers. The trail led straight down into the underground fighting pits. Massive, heavy paws tore chunks of wet earth into the air as the creature launched itself violently into the dark. The syndicate had touched what belonged to him, and the reigning alpha was going to paint the entire city red to get her back.
Cold, damp concrete bit into her bleeding cheek. The underground cartel cell reeked of oxidized copper and stale sweat. She pushed her aching body off the pitch-black floor. A massive concussion violently shook the stone ceiling. Heavy gunfire chewed through the thick iron door. Men screamed in the dark. Draven had come for her. Nova refused to wait in the dark. Her shaking hands scraped across the wet stone. Her fingers collided with a rusted iron water pipe. She locked her grip around the freezing metal. 15 years ago, a smuggler locked her in a sinking car trunk. The streets taught a brutal lesson. Nobody is coming. You have to smash your own way out. Nova swung the heavy iron with desperate feral strength. The solid pipe slammed into the rusty door hinges. Metal crunched loudly. The heavy iron door groaned and collapsed into the hallway. A deafening clang echoed off the concrete walls. She stumbled out, her breath locked in her throat. Flickering yellow security lights illuminated the narrow corridor. A dozen heavily armed cartel guards surrounded Draven. A suffocating wave of terror seized her chest. He was fighting in his human skin. He stayed human to bypass the biometric security gates. Now he was trapped in a concrete box. He was terrified to unleash the storm so close to her. A massive guard swung a thick wooden bat. The cracked ash struck Draven hard across the ribs. Bone splintered. Draven dropped painfully to his bleeding knees. Outmatched. Bleeding out. Nova stepped directly into the harsh yellow light. She dropped the heavy iron pipe. It clattered loudly against the stone. Draven. Her voice held the steady weight of forged steel. Let it out. The bruised billionaire snapped his head up. Golden eyes locked onto hers. You are not a nightmare to me. She lifted her chin, exposing her vulnerable throat to the dark. Let the shadow protect us. His bloody fingers twitched as the final iron lock on his humanity violently snapped.
The sharp, gritty scent of her absolute trust flooded his failing lungs. She didn't scream. She didn't look at him like a wild demon. The heavy iron chains around his soul snapped. The feral king violently seized control. A horrific, beautiful explosion of pure lethality followed. Immaculate bespoke silk shredded into bloody ribbons. Thick, silver-tipped fur violently breached his pale skin. Human skeletal structures ruptured and reformed with a sickening crunch. The world shifted from a losing brawl into a total slaughter. The cartel guards screamed in terror. Heavy weapons clattered against the floor. A 9-foot-tall shadow lunged forward. Lethal claws flashed in the flickering light. Wet concrete cracked beneath his massive weight. He slashed. He tore. He decimated every breathing threat near his mechanic. His old corporate mentor claimed raw emotion was a fatal weakness. The elite world demanded unfeeling perfection. The dirt taught a different truth. Wild emotion was his most lethal weapon. The silver beast threw its head back. A deafening roar shook the underground bunker to its foundation. The ruined hallway grew terrifyingly quiet. The sharp, metallic stench of fresh blood and deep, primal fear thickened the damp underground air. The metallic tang of fresh carnage hung thick in the air, the silence ringing so loudly it made Draven's eardrums ache as the bloodlust faded. The massive shadow stood panting heavily in the center of the destroyed corridor. Blood dripped from silver talons as the echoes of violence faded into complete nothingness. Slowly, the towering predator turned its heavy head. It locked glowing golden eyes directly onto the tiny, grease-stained woman standing completely fearless in the dark cell doorway. With her bitter scent hanging heavy in the air, the wild shadow took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The wet concrete compressed beneath its overwhelming physical weight. Nova's chest ached as she looked far up at the blood-soaked predator. She wondered if the untamed hurricane would recognize her or blindly attack her in the suffocating darkness. The mark burned deep inside his massive chest. Draven answered her silent question by releasing a low, deep earth growl that rattled the air like a revving truck engine. The Alpha closed the distance entirely. It ignored the broken cartel enforcers on the floor as the entire world narrowed down to the steady, frantic rhythm of her warm heartbeat. He lowered his giant, blood-soaked snout directly to the soft, pale skin of her neck. The space between them burned with an intense, overwhelming, and possessive heat. The protective guardian refused to harm her. It chose instead to inhale the deep, intoxicating scent of heavy grime and stubborn survival right off her racing pulse point. Nova didn't step back in fear. She slowly raised her calloused hand to bury her shaking fingers deep into his thick, silver fur as his razor-sharp teeth grazed her collarbone.
They clawed their way out of the subterranean slaughterhouse, trading the stench of the cartel pits for the icy bite of the city's highest elevation. Freezing rain slashed her face. The dusk downpour soaked her oil-stained overalls. Bruised muscles burned with lactic acid. She sprinted toward the towering glass doors of Syndicate headquarters. A massive silver blur crashed through the glass. Shards exploded outward. Deadly clear rain cascaded over the polished marble floor. Synchronized violence erupted. The crowned beast drew the heavy, mercenary gunfire. Nova slipped, completely unnoticed, through the freezing shadows along the walls. The Rust Barons taught her to hide. Elite society labeled her worthless. They were absolutely wrong. She bypassed complex biometric locks. She hacked the heavy steel security doors. She moved like a tactical, unstoppable ghost in the machine. Her underworld grit was the exact weapon this corporate war demanded. Her bruised fingers gripped a heavy, encrypted comms radio. She breached the Syndicate's glowing master server terminal. The quiet room reeked of recycled air and melting wire. 2 Syndicate enforcers charged into the server room. Black rifles raised. Safeties clicked off. The raging inferno lunged right over her head. Lethal talons ripped the heavy weapons away. Steel crunched. Bone snapped loudly in the cold air. He formed a lethal physical shield. Nova raised the heavy radio high. The memory of her burning warehouse fueled her grip. Scorched iron, suffocating smoke, blistering pain. She drove the heavy radio directly into the master glass screen. Blinding sparks showered the concrete like hot lightning. The electrical grid flatlined. Overhead lights died. Sirens choked into complete silence. The sudden, suffocating silence pressed against her eardrums, broken only by the ragged, desperate intake of their own breath as the building died around them. The massive wolf stood panting heavily in the pitch-black server room. The Syndicate empire evaporated. Corrupt, offshore, accounts wiped clean. The untouchable elites were officially bankrupt, reduced to nothing but ash in the dark. She reached through the pitch-black darkness, her grease-stained palm pressed firmly against his wet silver fur. She felt the deep, seismic tremor of his massive chest. The streets taught her to build beautiful engines from discarded metal, grinding the jagged edges down until they fit perfectly. She knew exactly how to anchor this violent storm. A single red emergency light snapped on down the corridor. It illuminated a trail of fresh blood leading directly to the old leader's final panic room door.
Victory tasted like bitter ash. The Alpha Predator slammed its weight against the reinforced steel door. Metal hinges groaned. Iron snapped cleanly in half. The heavy door caved inward. The darkened blur breached the dimly lit room. The sharp stench of cedar cologne and pathetic, sweating fear coated the tight air. The old Syndicate leader backed against the concrete wall. He raised a small plastic remote. His wrinkled fingers shook violently. A desperate, ugly smile cracked his pale face. "You think you won?" Spittle flew from the old man's lips. "You are nothing but a feral dog." The storm demanded blood. Lethal talons flexed against the concrete floor. The instinct to tear a human throat open burned like white-hot fire. A small, calloused hand pressed firmly against his massive shoulder. Nova stepped bravely into the glowing red emergency light, anchoring the violent tempest completely back to reality. The lethal shadow slowly retreated from the trembling executive. Draven forced his heavy bones to break and shift. He let the painful, violent transformation ripple loudly through his massive frame as the thick, silver fur finally dissolved. He collapsed to his bare knees. He was a breathless, exhausted human man, painted in shadows and copper blood. Draven locked his cold human gaze on the old executive. "Your offshore accounts are empty." His chest heaved. Your empire is ash. The war is over. A cornered rat always bites. 20 years ago, a rival smiled warmly before executing a hostile corporate takeover. A dying enemy is the most lethal threat in the room. Draven's jaw locked. The old man wasn't finished. The old leader crushed the red button on the remote. If I lose my empire, the old man hissed, you lose your life. Wall monitors flashed violently to life. Pure, suffocating ice seized Draven's chest. High-definition security footage played across the bright glass. The unmuted camera feed clearly showed Draven's massive, silver wolf form tearing Syndicate assassins into bloody ribbons. I just transmitted that feed to every global news network. The old man bared his teeth. The untouchable armor shattered. Draven's darkest, most lethal secret was exposed to the world. A lifetime of pristine corporate legacy burned to ash in a single second. Oxygen stopped in his tight throat. He had lost absolutely everything. The old leader ripped a silver revolver from his tailored jacket. Before the hammer could cock, Nova violently swung her heavy radio. She shattered the old man's wrist with a sickening crunch. The silver gun clattered loudly into the dark. We are not dying in a cage today, she whispered fiercely. She dragged the naked billionaire up from the concrete as global police sirens began to scream in the distance.
The wailing police sirens faded into a distant memory as the chaotic night finally fractured into a quiet, bleeding dawn. The world screamed his name across every global news network. But the dirt of the rust barons remained dead silent. Dawn bled over the twisted iron graveyard. Nova stood before the roaring industrial scrap incinerator. The acidic bite of melting plastic and electric copper coated her tongue. The syndicate executive rotted in a concrete holding cell. The corporate war was reduced to ash. Her hidden warehouse was gone. Her emergency funds incinerated. The safe, predictable cage she built to survive was completely vaporized. Her empty hands were finally free to hold something real. A memory of a dropped diamond ring in the wet gutter flashed behind her eyes. Stolen, shiny things always carried heavy, suffocating curses. Her bruised fingers dug deep into her pocket. She extracted the crisp, heavy corporate marriage contract. The thick parchment felt suffocating and utterly useless in her calloused grip. She refused the safety of a fake billionaire. She demanded the scarred man who unleashed the violent storm just to keep her lungs pulling oxygen. Heavy boots crunched against the dry gravel. The scarred monarch stepped into her oil-stained sanctuary. Torn black cotton clung to his broad chest. Dark violet bruises painted his jawline. Global syndicates were actively butchering his shipping empire on live television. His posture remained forged steel. The 3 yards of air between them crackled with raw static and heavy tension. Nova's pulse slammed violently against her ribs. Your glass tower is falling. A slow, devastating smile curved his split lip. Let it burn. Stripped of his silk armor, he radiated pure, lethal gravity. Nova held the heavy corporate contract over the roaring incinerator. She opened her grease-stained fingers. The ironclad rules drifted into the white-hot core, instantly disintegrating into floating black ash. I'm completely bankrupt. She locked her dark eyes onto his. The underground will come collecting my debts by midnight. Draven closed the distance. The heat of the flames illuminated the sharp angles of his face. The board votes to sever me at noon. My accounts are frozen. Equal ground. Forged in the dirt. A low, deep earth growl hummed deep inside his chest. Draven closed the final inch between them. His calloused thumb aggressively swiped a smudge of engine grease from her lower lip as his gaze dropped heavily to her mouth.
The bitter ash of his shattered legacy dissolved against the sharp, intoxicating scent of her industrial grime. The industrial incinerator roared. It cast a violent orange glow across her bruised cheekbones. He watched the white paper curl and blacken. The suffocating iron chains around his lungs finally snapped. He crowded into the fierce mechanic's space. His father once claimed a true sovereign never shares power. His father died a hollow, isolated man inside a freezing vault. Draven refused that sterile grave. He required a partner forged in fire. The untamed hurricane inside his blood settled into a deep, possessive hum. His scarred, blood-stained palms framed her jaw. His thumbs mapped the delicate pulse hammering in her throat. "I don't want a contract." The words scraped roughly against his vocal cords. "I need a partner to build a new empire in the ash." Her breath hitched. "Equal stakes?" "Always." The static snapped. Her calloused hands fisted in the torn cotton of his shirt. She violently yanked him down. Their mouths collided in a desperate, punishing collision of teeth and breath. No hesitation, no corporate politeness. A raw, starving claiming that bruised his lips and demanded total surrender. She tasted like metallic lightning and survival. He tasted like cold rain and pure, untamed power. He hooked his arms beneath her thighs, lifting her entirely off the oil-stained concrete. She locked her legs around his waist. Her fingers twisted ruthlessly into the thick strands of his dark hair to pull him even closer. They held the suffocating grip, breathing each other in as the rust barons woke to the dawn. They bled out the elites. They burned the cartels. They survived the dark. Her soul tethered perfectly to his shadow. Golden sunlight pierced the smog, illuminating the steel graveyard. Draven buried his face into her neck. His sharp teeth grazed her vulnerable pulse point as he whispered a lethal promise against her skin. "We hunt the rest of them tonight."